Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Helenmary Sheridan, and I am the Data Services Librarian at the University of Pittsburgh Health Sciences Library System. I'm also a member of the project team at the MIDAS Coordination Center, which is based at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was invited here to talk about the NIH data sharing and management policy that went into effect in January 2023. And some specific recommendations for members of the MIDAS network. So thank you for having me. This recording is, this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions, my email is at the end, but feel free to contact me. You can either contact the General MIDAS Coordination Center and the folks who put on this webinar series, or you can email me directly at helenmary@pitt.edu. And if you're not a member of my population at the University of Pittsburgh, you are a member of the MIDAS network, and I can also connect you to more resources at your own institution if that's something that's more appropriate. So feel free to send me an email or send MIDAS an email and they will connect us. So today, what are we talking about? I have some learning objectives for this webinar. At the end of this workshop, learners should be able to articulate the requirements of the new NIH DMS policy. And that DMS policy, again, is the data management and sharing policy. I will refer to it as the DMS policy or sometimes the DMSP throughout. To understand the policy's applicability to their own data, analysis, and research products. So think specifically, how does this relate to your work? And then identify at least one repository through which they can share their research outputs, because the policy is really focusing on sharing data and other research products through open, robust repositories or platforms that are specifically built for that purpose. And so we want to talk about repositories as opposed to sharing data on a possibly ephemeral website or just through GitHub or something like that. And then my main goal here is that everyone who's watching this webinar feels equipped to take the first steps towards complying with the policy. Maybe those first steps are asking further questions. Maybe they are writing a draft of your data management and sharing plan that you need to submit for NIH funding and have it looked at by someone who can give you critical feedback. But in any case, don't feel like you need to be able to leap in. It's more about first steps. Topics in this presentation, and I'm going to try to keep this timely. We're going to do a brief overview of the new NIH data management and sharing policy. We're going to talk about some special considerations for infectious disease modelers. We're going to talk about recommendations for sharing infectious disease data and models, so specific recommendations with MIDAS in mind. And then some tips for what to watch for in the coming year, because this policy went into effect again late January of this year. And so we've had the first rounds of proposals going in that include this new information, but we haven't necessarily gotten results back from those funding requests. So something to look for in addition to new announcements, webinars, et cetera, official information from the NIH is actually, what do program officers say? What gets funded? What budget requests are approved? So we'll talk about that at the end. So first topic, an overview of the NIH data management and sharing policy. So very basically, the new policy requires three things of researchers applying for NIH funding. And these requirements were developed after a long period of public comment and reworking. The draft policy was announced in 2020, and there was a period of comment even before that. This updates a previous policy from the early 2000s. So number one, that researchers think about how they will manage and share their scientific data before beginning their research. So before any project actually kicks off. Two, that they demonstrate that they've thought about it by submitting a detailed data management and sharing plan in their funding application with a budget requesting funds for relevant costs. So they want you to show proactively that you're thinking about this before you get started. And then three, that they comply with that approved data management and sharing plan, specifically by making their data as publicly available as possible, as soon as possible. And sorry, I'm doing some finagling on my side with the live transcript. I'm not sure if this is captured in the recording, but I'm trying to move it so it doesn't actually block my slides. So if you can see this, apologies for the mouse. All right. Okay, and then here I will share these slides. So this is a live link, but if you want to see the full text of the final NIH policy for data management and sharing, it is there. As is par for the course with these sorts of things, the actual policy is a little light on details of how you actually would comply with this, but it's the associated notices and supplemental information that gives you sort of the details on what to do. Some things to know, this policy applies to all research funded to any degree by NIH that results in the generation of scientific data. So the policy that I mentioned from, I want to say 2003, only applied to programs that were getting funded for $500,000 or more. Now, it doesn't matter how much money you get from NIH or what percentage of your funding is from them. If you produce scientific data, it's going to apply to you. It does not apply to activities that don't generate scientific data, like training, infrastructure development, or non-research activities. And the definition of scientific data here is a technical one. It is defined as that information which is deemed necessary to produce or validate scientific findings. So if it's something that like a training data, calibration, test data that you don't think is necessary for someone else to reproduce your work, that isn't the kind of data that they're talking about here. They're talking about necessary information that actually backs up your research. And then it went into effect for all applications submitted on or after January 25, 2023, or any activities or agreements executed thereafter. So we are fully in this period now. If you're on a current grant that is coming up for competitive renewal, this is going to apply to you. The policy requires submission of a data management and sharing plan outlining how scientific data and any accompanying metadata will be managed and shared, taking into account any potential restrictions or limitations. So that is what is required, the submission of a plan. It expects you to share as much data as possible while balancing confidentiality and other sensitive data concerns. But note that it doesn't require you to share all of your data. Right? What it's actually requiring is for you to lay out what data you will and will not share and your rationale for doing so. So if there is some reason why you can't share your data, maybe what you produce, the bulk of it isn't considered scientific data. You have a lot of, training and test data that you just throw out as a matter of course. That's fine. Maybe you can't share it because it is subject to some sort of confidentiality or legal ruling. That's fine too. What you need to do is you need to articulate that in your proposal and explain what data you can share and what you cannot. And if there's something where maybe you can come halfway to explain that and lay out a plan for meeting that expectation. And then the notice that has more information about that is the elements of an NIH data management and sharing plan. So you notice that there are two different terms that are used in this policy. There's data management and there's data sharing. And those are two distinct concepts, but they have a lot of overlap and they have a lot of a very tight relationship. So data management is everything you do with your data as you collect it, when you're analyzing it, when you share it. It's part of data sharing, right? To make it easily usable during and after the research process. So that's things like coming up with a good file naming system, building a folder tree structure to organize that data, validate your data, store it securely, right? So thinking about having a local copy and maybe one on an external hard drive and then having it stored in the cloud somewhere. That is all data management. Data sharing is then how you share that out to the world. So to your peers, to everyone, to just a direct collaborator, ideally in a way that can be easily reanalyzed. And that easily reanalyzed part really is made easier by good data management, right? Because everyone likes receiving a well-documented, well-organized data package where it's immediately obvious what you need to do to access and manipulate these data files, as opposed to a jumbled mess and no documentation and you don't even know what you're looking at. So data that are presented just in a paper, I can't tell you how many papers I've read across all disciplines that in a data availability statement, which I would say many, if not most journals now require, but aren't necessarily standardized, say all data in this analysis are included in the paper. And what they're referring to is a table that is reproduced in the PDF, and then maybe you can download that same table or maybe some figures in Word document file format as supplemental information. But there's nothing that you can do with that table, right? I mean, I guess you could copy and paste it into Excel or a CSV file and then like replot it or something, but it doesn't let you look at where the data came from. It doesn't give you any provenance information. It doesn't let you easily manipulate it. What the NIH is talking about when they say share your data, they're not talking about that sort of summary information that you present in the pretty picture, right? They're talking about the data that you built that from. And maybe, pre-processing or after processing and treatment, but before you, pulled out what was super important. They want it to be easily reused or reanalyzed or validated. Because the ultimate goal here, the reason that they are making or strongly encouraging people to share their data is not because they feel like they need to add more hoops for researchers to jump through, right? Not least because it's expensive, both for the researchers and God knows for the NIH. They are not looking to add another layer of bureaucracy here. What they want is to increase the reproducibility of research, to ease the research process so that others in your field can check your findings, they can reproduce your work, and B, so that they have access to data to explore new research questions. Because there is so much data out there that was collected for one reason, but could be very easily used for another question, for another analysis. And so it's both to help address the reproducibility crisis and also to lower the barrier to generate new scientific findings using already available data. And so they want you to share that data and then describe it and document it really well so that it becomes findable and accessible and interoperable between other systems, and finally, reusable. Furthermore, they're really deeply connected. Like I said, good data management practices, that file organization and file naming system make it so much easier for you to share your data when it comes time, right? Because I hear from a lot of people, I want to share my data. I think it's a good idea. I'm fully on board with it, but it just takes so long. You have to clean your data so that people who weren't in your lab can understand it. You have to create a README file. You have to upload metadata. And it's just, when you try to quantify the time and the money that it takes, it can get really complicated. But if you start your data management practices from the very beginning, like when you submit your proposal for funding, it becomes much easier to incorporate into your research process. And then you're not scrambling at the end. It's like cooking, right? Where professional chefs always talk about the importance of your mise en place. You want to have everything in your kitchen laid out. You know where your ingredients are, you know where your knives are, so that you don't have to make a huge mess and lose time putting everything together. Think of this as your research mise en place. And then second, sharing data in a public repository is a really effective way of storing, maintaining, preserving that data for the long term. Because once you upload it in a public repository, yes, it's available to other people, but it's also available to you. And if you put in the work to organize and document that and upload it to a repository, you don't have to think about it. You can go back in 10 years and it's still going to be well documented and well organized. And unlike, if it's living on your laptop and that laptop, gets rained on through rain coming through the open window, unlike a external hard drive where they have a lifespan of well under 10 years, unlike a lab website, right, where a little URL change means that link rot just decays access to the data, the repository is going to perform regular fixity checks to make sure that the file that you uploaded 10 years ago is exactly the same as what people can download in the future. So it reduces the maintenance work that you have to do over the long term. So I mentioned this is an update from a previous policy. If you have ever worked with that previous policy, it's worth highlighting some changes. So data or resource sharing plans were requested for many NIH funding applications, but not all. And sometimes it was per program or per center, per type of research. Now it's across the board, all applications. And some requested resource sharing plans, some requested data. Now it's a little more unified, where if sort of across the board, you are going to submit a data management sharing plan. If you're doing genomic research, that GDS plan that used to be separate is now subsumed into your data management plan. And then other resource sharing, like, people who have mouse models, etc., that remains a separate thing. So if you are breeding mice, that have a particular gene knockout or something, that is going to be a separate resource than data, because previously they were being all thrown together and there was a lot of confusion over what constituted data. Researchers are explicitly encouraged to publicly share data in easy formats to download and access, right? Not just as part of a publication or quote unquote by request, because there's been a lot of research in recent years quantifying, if there is a data availability statement that says access to the data is available by researcher request. Well, research teams actually went through and emailed those authors saying, hey, can you send me your data? I want to reanalyze it. And the return rate was really poor. Sometimes they got, data happily. Sometimes they got pushback, can you answer 10 questions as to what you're going to do with this data before I give it to you? Most often they just crickets, they got nothing. So the NIH really wants you to make it easy to access your data so that no one has to ask. So specifically, again, researchers are encouraged to share data in an online repository, not a personal or lab website. And then additional policies provide guidance on choosing the right repository or platform. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. I'm going to take a little break for some water, and then we're going to talk about special considerations for infectious disease modelers. All right, let's get into some specifics here. So I said infectious disease modelers. The obvious question is, does this policy apply to models? And that's a complicated question. If I had to put it in one word, that word would be no, not per se. And that's because the policy did not seem to be created with modeling in mind, quite frankly. The policy as written applies strictly to scientific data. And here's that technical definition I mentioned. The recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publications. So a model, which is a more complex entity, does not fit that fairly strict technical definition. Obviously, it's something that you want to display, share, allow people to rerun, but it's not like an exact fit in this box. However, there are those supplemental notices. So elements of an NIH data management and sharing plan, and these are clickable links if you access the slides, requires a data management and sharing plan, a DMSP, to describe all related tools, software, and/or code, and to state whether those additional resources are publicly available. So that element could potentially include things like code to create a visualization, analysis or transformation code to manipulate the data that are used in the study. So for example, let's say that I'm working on some sort of analysis or meta-analysis that includes multiple data sets from multiple sources. And so I write some Python code to harmonize these, right? To normalize all the data and bring them together and clean up data sets that for some reason define the same variables in different ways. And then I write some R code to create a visualization, and I create a Shiny app to put them on the web. So I want to make this data discoverable and let people do something with it via a web interface. And I share all of that on GitHub. Well, each of those things are related tools, software, or code that allow and facilitate access to the data. So I would want to describe all of those in my data management and sharing plan. It doesn't matter that I haven't written them yet. And honestly, if I don't know exactly what I'm going to do, right? Like maybe I'm going to do an R script to create the visualization, or maybe I'm going to write it in JavaScript using D3. I haven't made up my mind. That's okay, right? I can put these general plans in my data management and sharing plan. But what I'm going to say is I will write some code, probably in Python, to harmonize these data sets, or possibly R. And then I'm going to create a visualization, and I'm going to share that. And I will make these accessible via my GitHub repository at github.com/Helenmary. And that is That is demonstrating compliance with the policy. Furthermore, models obviously make intensive use of data, right? They are created, trained, and tested with data. If scientific data are generated, collected, processed, transformed, treated, normalized, harmonized, or digitized for the project, right? Maybe you are working with data that have only been shared in paper format, or public reports of some things, or clippings, or things that were previously published in PDF and not available as data sets. They should be managed and shared under the policy. Publicly available data that is not changed in any way still requires management, right? So this happens with a lot of secondary data analysis. Let's say that you are using a data set that is already publicly available. It has already been shared. It is not your data, but you are doing something with that data. You have downloaded the data sets and you are either treating and transforming the data in some way, or you are just, pulling out variables and doing some sort of reanalysis, but you're not fundamentally changing the data in any way. Maybe that does not require sharing, but it does require management. And so remember, this is a data management and sharing plan. So if you are working with like a huge survey, a national survey of some kind, well, and you download those files, how are you going to manage them? How are you going to store that data? How will they be organized? You don't need to reproduce your entire file system here, right? But you need to say they will be stored locally and accessed via the NHANES website, or I'm using the SWAN survey data and we'll keep a local copy, on our lab machines. That's fine. And they will continue to be available through the website where we got them. And with digitized data or secondary data, I think it is worth keeping in mind whether the analysis or any treatment that you're performing creates a new data set that is substantially different from what you started with, because sometimes a treated data set, that secondary data, becomes its own creature enough to warrant resharing, right? If you create a data set performing some sort of treatment on data that you think could potentially be of use to other researchers, it's worth sharing. You need to give proper credit to the originator of the original data set, right? You're not going to pretend that you just came out of this, from collecting your own data entirely, but maybe that is doing work that other people would find valuable. So if you reuse and transform already available data, it may be sufficient to just cite the original data set and share your processing scripts. I used such and such publicly available COVID-19 data, and I did a bunch of analyses, using R and Python and my scripts for what I'm going to share. That is totally fine. Or you might want to reshare the transformed data set. This is going to be a judgment call. And I think that that's something that communities need to come up with a norm, right? So I encourage you to talk with other researchers, with your colleagues, find out, hey, what are you doing? What would be useful to you? If you were interested in doing a reanalysis of data, what would you hope that the original creators of this data set had done for you to make your life easier? New data produced in the modeling process would be covered under the policy and should be shared. So if there's anything that is novel, you should share that. Or if it's something that you can't share for X and Y reason, you put that in your plan and you talk about why you can't share it. If for some reason, by the way, this comes up all the time, if you're using like Medicaid or Medicare data, right? Because this is something that is controlled by the government. You have qualified access to the data, but it's not something that you can reshare. And so when I look at data management sharing plans related to that data, they talk about, we are using Medicaid data that is provided by the HHS, and we are storing, a copy locally under University of Pittsburgh IT protection, but we are going to share our analysis scripts, our log files, et cetera, and make those public. That has been acceptable so far. I can't say, that it's absolutely going to be okay this year because we haven't gotten results back from the first round of funding, but that is what people are doing. And so if you are working with some sort of commonly protected data, talk about how you will manage what you're working with locally, talk about how you will share any results or novel data or processing scripts, but don't worry too much. You don't need to tell the government that you're not sharing the data they told you can't share, right? So it's going to be okay. What matters here is that you decide upon and detail your strategy before you execute it. They are not looking to punish anyone. They are not looking to take marks off. What the NIH is trying to do here is create or help a culture change where people are more open to sharing data, more open to data reuse, but also being more thoughtful about stewarding their data through the entire research process, and that stewardship has to really start at the beginning. So identifying repositories for infectious disease models is a tricky thing, right? Because like I said, the policy is not written with modeling in mind, and a lot of the data sharing ecosystem is not created with modeling in mind. There is no currently available robust repository, as far as I am aware, I'm not omniscient, that is specific to the infectious disease modeling community. And if I am wrong and you know of one, please, please, please email me, helenmary@pitt.edu, because I would love to know about it. A possible match, the closest thing I have found is biomodels. That this has many models, many interpretations of what a model can be. And this is across many biological and biomedical disciplines. There is some infectious disease work in there. I frankly don't know how commonly used this is. They say mathematical models, but there's a lot more computational modeling that is included in here. So if this is good for you, let me know. If you look at this and you think, this has no relevance, I'm also interested in hearing about this. But for your data, for your scripts, for everything else, there are a lot of repositories out there. And so there's probably a good enough match for you. I would not recommend creating a new repository. That gets very expensive. But there is some official guidance out there and some officially recommended guidance. So first, the NIH has a list of NIH-supported scientific data repositories. Many of these are big open things like the Cancer Imaging Archive, right? Or, dbGaP. So big repositories that, frankly, if your research is appropriate for them, you might already know. But that is a good list. Again, all of these links are clickable. There is Nature's data repository guidance. So these are the repositories that they recommend people who are publishing in their journals use. Again, they are discipline specific. So if you work in cytology, perhaps there's a cytology specific repository that will take your data. There is a list of generalist repositories that's put out by the NIH. These are not official recommendations, but these are sort of what the NIH thinks is well supported and that a lot of people use. And then included in that list are some things that I don't think meet the technical definition of a repository, but they're repository-like computational platforms. So things like the Synapse platform from Sage Bionetworks. There is re3data.org, which is the Registry of Research Repositories. I will caution you that re3data.org can be overwhelming. It is definitely a big index rather than a precise index. So there are things that are only available to researchers working in Austria. There are repositories that are only available to a closed institutional network, but you will find them. And also many things that are no longer being maintained. So sort of buyer beware when you're using the Registry of Research Repositories, but it's a good place to find something if you were looking for a particular niche. And then finally, your institution's own institutional repository, if that's available and appropriate. If your institution, your university, your research network, your professional association might have an institutional repository, which is a generalist repository that accepts material from affiliated researchers. It might include only publications. That is the older model of institutional repository, but it might also include data and code and things like that. That is something that you should check out. And the first stop, if you have one of those, or to find out more, would be your academic library. Those are usually maintained by librarians like me. Other platforms, which those other platforms are sometimes called data access portals, might charge fees. I would say in my experience, it's 50-50. Half are free, half are fee-based, either per submission or for ongoing support. And usually how this works is Dryad, for example, which is an excellent data repository. It's a generalist data repository, great place to share your data, charges a $120 at this time fee per data submission. And that is often data that is associated with a particular publication. So that is a per submission fee. You submit today, you pay 120 bucks. You submit again in 5 years, you pay another 120 bucks. Others, and this is especially true for like cloud storage or the platformy non-repository options, are ongoing support. So you pay based on, I want this to be available for 10 years. I want my data to be hosted on AWS with some sort of custom built portal, for 15 years, and you pay yearly. That is fine. Both are perfectly acceptable options, right? But you need to know what you're getting into, because these costs can be included in your NIH data management and sharing plan in the budgeting section. And there are some publications here. They have a supplemental notice for allowable costs. And then there's another publication, forecasting costs of biomedical data preservation. But I don't have a slide on it. These ongoing support charges, you can only include allowable costs for the duration of your research period. So if your funding period is 5 years and you pay for 15 years of data access, the 10 years after your period ends cannot be included in your budget. So if you can front load that and pay, a one-time cost for 15 years, that is preferable, because anything that goes beyond your period is not an allowable cost. Okay, another water break here. All right, some more recommendations for sharing infectious disease data and models. So Midas and I strongly recommend sharing models, data, and all materials used to produce them in a public data repository. So you have options to do something on Amazon Web Services, right, or a cloud-based network, but we really recommend a public repository because it's a lot less work for one thing, and it's much easier to discover on the web for another. Ideally one with a GitHub integration. So Zenodo, for example, is a public generalist repository, which means it accepts stuff from all disciplines, that has a really nice integration with GitHub. So if you put your code up on GitHub, you can archive a version of your repository and deposit it in Zenodo. It gets linked to your data or any other materials. You can put publications in Zenodo as well. But it does a really nice job of sort of saving a snapshot of your code at one point in time. Depositing data in a repository makes it more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Those are the same words that I used earlier in this presentation, and that's because they are the FAIR principles, which are a recommended set of guidelines to help improve reproducibility in the sciences. That is possible, or frankly, probable, right? Because it takes a lot more work to do on most other websites. And then archiving code in a repository. And we're not talking about GitHub repository, we're talking data or publication repository. Preserves and maintains it beyond what GitHub alone can do. GitHub is great. I use GitHub, I teach GitHub, I recommend it. They are well funded, they're popular, they do have some preservation infrastructure, but they are not they're not built for preservation, right? They are built for version control. They are built for collaborative software development. Whereas a repository has a lot more preservation specific features. So using them together, using a GitHub integration with a repository, gets the best of both worlds, where you can really archive that collaborative code development for the long term. There are a couple of sort of anti-recommendations I would make. So the NIH policy allows data to be uploaded as supplementary material on PubMed Central articles or shared via cloud platforms like Amazon Web Services. This is sort of their third tier of recommendations, but I don't think you should do that unless you have no other option. So PMC supplementary materials, they're not independently discoverable. They're always linked with that publication. And so they're less findable. There's a real value in having data and code independently discoverable, because sometimes the code can demonstrate a method or a technique that someone wouldn't necessarily be looking for the paper on. Or the data, they're not necessarily looking for a publication because maybe they have a different research question or they're from a slightly different research field, but the data can be applicable to both. Cloud storage systems like Amazon Web Services, Azure, Globus, etc. They need that public endpoint to be findable and accessible, right? Like you need to publicize that in some way. So that requires an extra step to make people aware of where they can access the data. That can be expensive, that can be difficult to maintain, whereas a repository just takes care of that for you. Any of the NIH's recommended repositories on that discipline-specific data repository list or the generalist repositories that they don't officially endorse, but they link to, they're going to be fine. They're going to do the job. They meet the basic criteria for robust data repositories, but they do have differences. They're not all created for the same purposes. They don't all have the same level of funding or focus on data versus something else. So they differ in the range of accepted file types. And here I'm specifically talking about the generalist repositories because the NIH's recommended repositories are often for a specific discipline that you might be locked out of. But they're going to differ in the range of accepted file types. So some of them, that is linked to, they will only take non-proprietary open format data. Some won't, some will take everything. Costs, again, some are free, some have one-time costs, some have ongoing support charges. They will differ in the level of curation provided for metadata and documentation. So that fee, the Dryad charges that I mentioned per data submission, that money goes to pay a trained professional to open your data set and make sure it works, that the file is not corrupted, that your columns and your variables are appropriately named and described. And if they're not, that person is going to send whoever deposits the data a little email saying like, hey, I think you need to check this because your file's corrupted, or it'd be really nice if you generated a README, right? So they're going to actually touch and curate that data for you. Others like Figshare, for example, is a big generalist repository. You can put anything in there and people do. There is no checks well, there are basic checks for corruption, but there aren't checks that make sure that the file is what you said it was. And there is no check to make sure that it is of scientific value, let's say. So there are high school students who are putting their AP art history presentation slides in there, and good for them, but that may not be what you want. And then habitual use by certain disciplines or communities. So this is something that, as far as I have heard from people in the community, the infectious disease modeling community doesn't necessarily preferentially use a particular repository, but that is not the case in other disciplines. So for example, there's no discipline-specific repository for looking at health disparities using Medicaid data and that sort of econometric style analysis. But community members, and this is all, word of mouth kind of thing, tend to use the Harvard Dataverse generalist repository. So perhaps this is a culture that you can help create. For a comparison of generalist repositories, see the comparison chart from the American Geophysical Union. And this is a clickable link. They have a really nice PDF that just lays out the linked generalist repositories and has things like, what do they accept? How much does it cost? Do they provide curation services? And other factors upon which those generalist repositories differ. So it's a nice, quick recommendation. Some recommendations for describing your research products once you have them to share, or in the beginning, as you are collecting them, because this is part of data management as well. We really recommend describing your files with metadata. Metadata is those little bits of information that are understandable to humans, but possibly more importantly to machines. They are what lets the internet discover information, discover files, sort them, offer them, in more than just a full text search. So metadata can be things like author names, data set titles, subjects, including pathogens and disease names, geographic scope, if you are looking at disease prevalence in a certain area, the time period. Are you looking at all time? Are you looking at 2003 to 2008? File format as well. So for some specific recommendations of elements that you might want to be capturing in your metadata, see the paper, An Implementation Framework to Improve the Transparency and Reproducibility of Computational Models of Infectious Diseases from Pokotnaya et al. And we have a link here that's in PLOS Computational Biology. And then there is some standardization that you can do with this metadata as well. So you can source your pathogen names and your keywords and other elements from controlled vocabularies and ontologies. So you can think of these as, sometimes these are called authorities, sometimes they are called controlled vocabularies, a term list. An ontology is really just a representation of these terms that has some semantic relationship between them. You might also see these called taxonomies. Generally, they refer to the same kind of thing. So for pathogens and diseases, SNOMED CT is the place. There's the SciCrunch registry that has a lot of reagents and mouse models and things like that. For organisms, you probably want the NCBI taxonomy. And then for general keywords, MESH, which is the Medical Subject Heading Index provided by the National Library of Medicine, is a good place to look. When you do this, if possible, you want to reference the URI, the Uniform Resource Identifier of vocabulary entries, to enable machine processing for that. And part of that is because these names, these vocabulary terms might change, right? MESH, for example, updates their list every year. So maybe 1 year we call it monkeypox, right? And then the next year, the name has been changed to Mpox because it's a less stigmatizing name, right? Well, you want those links to go to the same term in whatever you're using. And that uniform resource identifier, which is a string of alphanumeric characters, is going to point to wherever that term lives in the vocabulary, even if it changes from monkeypox to Mpox. So that is better. Even if your system is not dynamically loading that term, it's going to allow other systems, possibly systems in the future, to dynamically update those terms as we go. And then there's a version of that URI for people too, right? So we encourage all authors to acclaim an ORCID, a unique numeric ID that disambiguates each author from anyone with a similar name. So I, Helenmary Sheridan, am, as far as I have discovered, the only Helenmary Sheridan in the entire world. There is no other like me, but that is pretty rare. So if you have a name that, there is one other person in academia, it is worth claiming an ORCID. And this also creates a little profile of your publications, your associated collaborators, your employers, etc. So it is worth creating. And then you can link that in a lot of publication and journal and funder interfaces to make all these systems work together and sort of track your activity. When you are manipulating data, collecting data, sharing data, it is worth documenting your process. And there are a couple different ways to do that. So if you are writing code, comment out your code, create a change log of major versions that you create. And sometimes, GitHub will do this for you, but you might also want to create a text version as well. READMEs. I love READMEs, super simple text documents. They are worth including with code, but you can also create a README for data, just to explain, hey, what is this thing? If you find it on a repository somewhere with no contextual information, what am I looking at? Data dictionaries and code books. These can make just interpreting the data much simpler for you, if you were looking at this in 5 years and you've forgotten everything about what you're doing, but also for other researchers. There's a little cheat sheet about documentation formats. Kristen Briney at Caltech has put together a really nice thing. So her guide to research data documentation methods is a clickable link here that I recommend you look at. But my number one recommendation of creating a README, it is so simple. It is the equivalent of a message in a bottle, right? Accompanying your data on the waves of the internet. So if your data set gets separated from its associated publication, maybe someone downloaded the data and saved it to their Dropbox and then emailed it to a collaborator, and that collaborator has no idea where it came from. That README, if it's packaged in the same file folder, is going, or maybe an associated text document or a tab in an Excel book, is going to provide them that little accompanying contextual information. It's always a .txt file, a plain text file, so small and basic, you can open it on any computer. You can open these on a hand-cranked computer. They date back to at least 1974, traditionally included in software downloads, and they might be older than that. That is just the first reference I could find. And a README should include the most essential information about your project, right? The need to know info. What is this? Who made it? If I have questions, who should I contact? You can get a lot more complicated, but always include that basic who, what, where, when, why, how information if you can. So message in a bottle, think of it that way, that, if your data is spread far and wide and you don't know who's going to open it, at least you can provide them this little guide so that they can find you and ask you any explaining questions. For writing a README, there are a couple of guides out there. If you look up on the internet how to write a good README, most of the advice you find is going to be bad. And that's because most of the advice is aimed at new software development students who are trying to write a fancy, flashy README on GitHub. READMEs are automatically created in GitHub using Markdown. And they will tell you things like, use pictures, use a logo, create branding for yourself. No, do not do that. When you write a README, think of a brand new undergraduate student, right, who doesn't know the norms in your field necessarily. Think of someone who is not a native speaker of your language. You want it to be as clear as possible so that it is as accessible as possible to people who do not necessarily have the contextual knowledge and the background that you do. So 3 helpful resources, these links: making a useful README file for research projects, especially computational research. That's a great resource. It's just a blog post. Harvard Longwood Medical Area's checklist for creating a README file, and then a guide from the Cornell Library for writing README style metadata. Finally, we have some ways of looking towards the future. So what is going to happen this year? Some recommendations. I am creating this in May 2023. I don't know when you are watching it because this will primarily be a recording. But at the time, the best way to find out about new developments is to watch the NIH's new scientific data sharing website. They launched it last year just for, the new data management and sharing policy. But there they put out announcements of new official webinars, new publications, guidance, new sections of the website that have more details. So that is worth checking out. It's the NIH Scientific Data Sharing. Watch the NIH Office of Data Science Strategy events calendar. They have a lot of calls, they have webinars, they have meetings related to data management and sharing. And you can sign up for their newsletter, which I highly recommend. So you can get that delivered straight to your inbox with updates and guidance. The initial just-in-time processes should begin summer 2023. So early applicants who've already submitted their data management and sharing plan will get feedback soon. And the way that works, because I didn't mention this before, is when you submit your application for funding, you're going to submit your data management and sharing plan as part of that. You're going to include your budget request saying, I need this money to pay a graduate student to do our data curation for us. And then your program officer at the NIH is going to look at that plan and they are going to give you feedback on it. They're going to either approve or deny it. And if they find it lacking, they're not going to throw out your whole proposal. Instead, they're going to get back to you with feedback and you can modify that in the JIT process. They do not see your budget, or rather they don't score your budget. And they don't score your overall proposal based on your plan. Instead, the budget part and only the budget gets sent to peer reviewers. So the peer reviewers will look at what you put in for your budget and they're going to say, however much for a graduate student, that seems reasonable. They're not going to see the rest of your plan. So they will only have comments on the budget portion of that. They're not going to score, these peer reviewers are not going to score your application with your data management and sharing plan in mind. They're not going to see that. So any feedback that you get from your DMSP, your data management and sharing plan, is going to come from your program officer, and they're not going to reject you. They're going to work with you to improve that plan so that it's something that they think adequately meets that expectation of planning for and sharing data appropriately, and that it's something that you can actually comply with, right? Because perhaps you say, I'm going to share every single crumb of data that I ever produce, and I'm going to blast it to every person on Earth. Well, that's obviously unsustainable. That's not something you can comply with. So they want it to work for you too. But we haven't gotten any results back. So that should happen this year. And then contact email. If you are looking for more information, if you have questions, I recommend checking the Scientific Data Sharing website and the Office of Data Science Strategy for webinars that might answer your questions. They also have a fairly extensive and updated FAQ section, so they might have already answered your question if it's something that frequently comes up. But you can contact me at helenmary@pitt.edu. You can contact Midas and they will funnel your questions to me. You can also contact your own institution's academic librarians, because I am part of the data services team at the University of Pittsburgh Health Sciences Library System. Many, many research professionals, data librarians like me exist, and they are probably happy to talk to you about this. So yeah, check your own people first. But otherwise, I hope that this was useful to you. If you have any further questions, go to those places, contact me, and I hope that you have a great proposal process. Thanks very much.